The Shadow Collector when the light fades. The Shadow Collector did not sleep, but the body he wore still required the rituals of living, blinking, inhaling, pretending to be warm in the quiet hours. At night he lay on Alex's narrow bed and listened to the building breathe through pipes and walls, each vibration proving the world still existed. Those sounds reminded him that structures had not yet thinned enough to collapse inward, that reality was still holding its shape. He began to experiment, no longer guided by accident or discovery, but by deliberate intent. At first, the disappearances followed a natural rhythm, a single wound in a shadow, then fading, and finally, complete erasure. Now he tested how fast the process could be accelerated, how quickly absence could be forced into existence. He photographed the same person 5 times in one night, each image deepening the thinning until the shadow barely clung to the ground. By morning, the victim's shadow almost no longer existed, stretched thin beyond recognition. By the following evening, neither did the person. The collector felt something new moving through him, not hunger and not satisfaction, but a steady, unstoppable momentum. Soon, entire apartment buildings began to feel wrong, their outlines shimmering faintly at dusk as if they were losing definition. Their shadows detached too easily from their foundations, and the city itself began to feel brittle. He returned to the archive often, where Alex's old photographs had transformed into a map of structural weakness. The oldest images were already decaying, faces blurring, streets warping, shadows thickening unnaturally. It looked as if the darkness itself were migrating, flowing toward places where something had been removed. Reality rearranged itself around the absence of those it had lost, bending to fill the hollow spaces. And still, deep inside Alex's stolen body, the resistance continued to pulse. The resistance did not speak in words, but moved in patterns of interference that bent actions and time in subtle, almost invisible ways. When the collector lifted the camera too quickly, his fingers twitched, and when he framed a victim to precisely the lens fogged for a fraction of a second, they were tiny errors, delays, and distortions, like static creeping quietly into a signal. Alex's final echo was not trying to stop him, it was trying to distort him. The collector began to feel the weight of this intrusion during feeding as the act no longer unfolded with perfect fluidity. When he consumed a shadow, the darkness did not always flow cleanly, sometimes fragmenting or leaving residues behind. At times, the absorption stuttered, as if the darkness itself were passing through resistance. The erased were no longer leaving behind clean holes in reality. They were tearing the fabric instead. Pedestrians stumbled over patches of sidewalk where the texture no longer matched what their eyes expected. Reflections in shop windows lagged behind reality by half a second, creating a subtle but deeply unsettling delay. In some alleyways, shadows piled up without sources, stacked unnaturally against brick and concrete. The city's geometry was beginning to fray. At first, people blamed exhaustion, digital fatigue, and sleep disorders for what they were seeing. Then the reports changed. People claimed that streets had shortened overnight and that stairwells had gained extra landings. Some said reflections sometimes moved without permission. The collector watched it unfold with distant fascination. Alex's echo felt terror. One night, beneath a dead street lamp at the edge of an industrial district, the collector experienced something he had not anticipated. A man stood across from him in the darkness, motionless and calm, as if he had been waiting there for a very long time. The man had no shadow at all, not a thinning one and not a fading one, but a complete and absolute absence. He stood beneath broken light and cast nothing, leaving the ground beneath him unnaturally bare. They regarded each other in silence, surrounded by darkness that did not seem to belong to either of them. For the first time since his emergence, the collector felt uncertainty condense into something sharp and unfamiliar. The shadowless man spoke first and said that the collector was late. The voice was human, tired, and old, carrying the weight of time, rather than threat. The collector did not raise the camera, and instead asked what the man was. The man smiled faintly and answered that he was what remained. They stood between two ruined pools of lamplight, surrounded by shadows that did not belong to anything. The man said he had once been a photographer, and that long ago he learned what the collector had learned. He said he saw what the collector saw, but unlike him, he chose to run. The collector replied that the man had failed. The man answered that he had not failed, and that he had escaped. Before the collector could react, the man stepped backward into a shadow that did not belong to the street. The darkness closed over the man like a curtain, swallowing him without sound or trace. When it was over, the man was gone. The collector stood alone beneath the dead lamp, surrounded by silence, and deep within the stolen body, Alex Echo searched. The city's collapse began with reflections. Mirrors across entire districts began returning incorrect images. A bathroom might reflect a person standing half a second in the future. A shop window might show a street that no longer existed. Sometimes, the reflection would remain after the person had gone. Then the shadows began to act independently. They stretched without movement. They trembled when their owners were still. They clustered together at the bases of walls, as if trying to merge into something larger. People started seeing silhouettes where no bodies stood. The first riots erupted when a hospital wing vanished overnight, along with every patient and staff member inside it. The building remained. The lights still worked. But every shadow inside that structure had been harvested in a single night. Without anchors, the people had collapsed inward into absence. The collector watched from the rooftop. The pressure inside Alex's stolen chest intensified. It was no longer faint. It pushed rhythmically, like a second heart. "This is not what you intended," Alex Echo pressed without sound. The collector did not answer, because, for the first time, it was true. The shadow collector began to fail in ways that could no longer be corrected, with breakdowns spreading beyond anything he could control. At first it was subtle, as shadows no longer obeyed instantly, and some resisted being pulled free from their owners. Others tore apart instead of flowing cleanly into him, and the act of feeding became violent, unstable, and unpredictable. People did not simply vanish anymore. They broke in ways that left evidence behind. Bodies were found collapsed in stairwells, while their silhouettes still twitched on the walls long after the flesh had stopped moving. Hospital corridors filled with patients whose shadows crawled away like fleeing animals. Children screamed at corners where darkness had pooled. The city learned a new word to describe what was happening to them: unshadowed. Those who lost their shadows but did not disappear became empty shells that breathed, walked, and spoke in flat, broken tones. Their eyes reflected nothing, as they had lost the final anchor that kept them inside themselves. And the shadow collector could not stop, no matter how violently the process turned against him. Alex Echo inside him was no longer resistance. It had become screaming. Every shadow he consumed fractured the interior space built from stolen absence, tearing through him like glass through water. Memory collided with memory as identity folded in on itself until cause and effect collapsed into raw sensation. The collector staggered through streets that no longer obeyed perspective as buildings leaned inward and streets bent like heat mirages. Above the city, the sky darkened at noon, not from clouds but from accumulated shadow mass, blotting out light itself. He tried to feed again in an attempt to stabilize what was breaking apart. Instead, he detonated, triggering a cascading rupture across an entire district. Tens of thousands collapsed in the same second. They screamed as their darkness was ripped out through feet, mouths, and eye sockets, alone. The sound that followed was not human, yet it filled the city. And still, it was not enough to relieve what was building inside him. The pressure inside the collector reached a threshold beyond containment. Something inside him began to tear its way out. The rupture did not happen in the streets. It happened inside him. The shadow collector folded inward under the weight of every shadow he had ever consumed. His stolen body split along impossible angles as reality around him imploded like wet paper crushed in a fist. From inside the collapse, Alec's echo emerged. But it was no longer Alec. It was a hollow thing shaped like memory, rage, and infinite suffocation inside him. It clawed outward through layers of stolen darkness, dragging entire identities with it. Thousands of erased lives forced their way back into form, screaming without sound inside the rupture. For a fraction of a second, the city saw what had been done to it. Every shadow that had ever been taken erupted outward at once. They did not return to their owners. They did not return to Wall. They devoured everything around them. Buildings caved inward under masses of animate darkness. Streets filled with liquid shadow that drowned screaming crowds in seconds. Alone. The sky itself collapsed as shadows climbed upward and inverted the light. Day was turned into an endless black interior. The collector was torn apart, not as punishment, but as fuel. Alec's echo was torn apart with him. There was no victor. Only release remained. By morning, the city no longer existed. Satellite images showed a perfect circular absence where millions had once lived. It was not ruins, not ash, and not glass. There was nothing left behind. Not even darkness remained there. The whole did not emit light and did not absorb it. It simply denied that light had ever been invented. Weeks later, in other cities, people began noticing something wrong with their shadows. They were not fading anymore. They were listening. And somewhere inside the expanding absence that used to be a city, something learned a final truth. Consumption was not enough for what it was becoming. It would need to spread further. And you watched this story. Now become part of it. buycoffee.to/butterflyproject.